Hello and welcome. We are so pleased to have you join us in the second in our series of social justice investing webinars. Today's webinar is Social Justice Investing in Practice, Examples from the Field. My name is Mika Weinstein. I'm the Director of Operations at Just Futures, the primary sponsor of this event, and we're so glad to have you with us. If you haven't already, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat with your name, pronouns, affiliated organization if you have one, and an acknowledgement of the original caretakers of the land that you're on. And we'd also love to hear why you joined this webinar today. Before we really get started, I do want to take just a moment for grounding after the multiple shootings that have happened in the last few weeks. I'm sure it's weighing heavy on all of our hearts. We're in this work because we want to create a world where everyone is taken care of. Thank you for being here and being part of this work. And we'll take just a moment and then we'll continue with our program. Right. So the Just Futures team is distributed across Turtle Island. I myself am located on the unceded land of the Piscataway and Nacotchtank nations. The Justice Funders Office, they're the other primary hosts of this event, are located on the unceded land of the Lishan people. All of us who are not Indigenous, particularly in the philanthropic and finance sectors, have benefited from the genocide waged against Indigenous people and the theft and occupation of Indigenous lands. So you can learn more about the original caretakers of the land that you're on using the link on this slide or that was dropped into the chat. If you experience any technical issues during this webinar, you can use the number on the screen to contact Zoom support directly using the webinar ID that's there. Or you can contact Courtney from our team by emailing courtney@justfutures.co. This webinar will be presented in English. There are auto-generated closed captions available. If you want to turn those captions on or off, you can do so by clicking on the CC Live Transcript icon that should be on that toolbar, either on the bottom or the top of your Zoom window. We will be recording today's webinar, and the link to the recording will be shared with all participants and registrants. If you want to submit a question to the panel during the webinar today, we ask that you please use the Q&A feature that's on, again, that same webinar toolbar. You know, we already see a lot of action in the chat, which is great, but if you ask a question there, it'll be harder for the panelists to find it and see it. So if you do want to ask a question of one of our presenters, please make sure you use the Q&A function. All right, so in case you missed the first session, I want to share briefly about Just Futures and why we produced this research and event. Our co-founders, Alex Sangchin and Steve Choi, came together about a year ago to start Just Futures. Through decades of working in movement organizing, the nonprofit space, and philanthropy, they experienced themselves and also, heard from friends and peers about a lot of unmet needs around retirement and investing. So our mission is to create a platform that connects nonprofits and their workers and other, mission-driven organizations and folks with investments that are increasingly aligned with the needs of people, communities, and our one planet. We are a people of color and gender diverse public benefit corporation, but outside of our staff and our own work histories, we want true movement governance. So we are committed to 30% non-dilutable ownership by nonprofit and social movement organizations that are working toward a just transition to a regenerative economy. Our first product offering will be a 401k retirement plan, which will soft launch later this summer. We're very excited about that. And with this initial offering, we're trying to tackle the fact that of the $9 trillion that is currently invested in 401k or 403b retirement plans, only a sliver, 3%, is deployed in either responsible or ESG funds. And even those funds raise ethical questions. And that's something that we talked about in the first session. If you missed it, we recommend that you go back and check out that recording. So the goal of Just Futures is to create a vehicle that can serve as a bridge, moving capital over time from extractive investments to less extractive investments, and eventually into restorative and regenerative funds. It's not easy. There are a ton of regulatory barriers that make it very difficult to put retirement savings into, for example, the funds that are being featured here today. So while we have to start at this end of the spectrum, moving from extractive to less extractive, in public markets, we sponsored this research to help move us toward that possibility. And this research is really just the beginning. On the topic of retirement, we know that some of you are particularly interested in how social justice investing intersects with retirement benefits and savings. So we'll get into that overlap in the third session. That will be the focus of our webinar on June 22nd. Make sure that you register for that session as well. We'll also be publishing our written report that mirrors the content presented across all three webinars in advance of that session. But I wanted to make a quick plug for a separate webinar that's outside of this series. Just Futures commissioned additional research on where and how retirement benefits are really falling short. Investments are one part of that kind of overall equation, but there are other systemic issues going on with retirement benefit provision. And this is so important because retirement is one of the most accessible vehicles for building wealth and closing the wealth gap, for workers and ordinary people. Things that are confusing or seem benign, like what seems like very minuscule fees on your retirement accounts, can actually add up to lost savings of tens of thousands or even over $100,000 over the course of your lifetime, taking into account compound interest. Anywhere that we're talking about wealth, we have to talk about equity. So in this webinar that's coming up, Reclaiming Retirement for All, we'll talk about how you can check if your plan is designed equitably, your workplace plan, how funders can support their grantees in this area, how we can push back on the industry to be more transparent and values aligned, and more. So we really hope you'll join us on June 9th. And I think we'll be dropping the registration link in the chat if you want to join. I'm going to give a quick shout out and thank you to our co-sponsors who have been so amazing in supporting the production of this event series: Justice Funders, Solidaire, Center for Economic Democracy, Resource Generation, Full Spectrum Capital Partners, Common Future, Transform Finance, Funders for Justice, Neighborhood Funders Group, and New Economy Coalition. If you aren't familiar with any of these groups, I recommend that you check them out. And I know that some of them will also be live tweeting this event using the hashtag social justice investing. So if you're on Twitter, please do join in that conversation. I'm going to briefly introduce today's speakers, and then I'll hand it over for the presentations. So I've already introduced myself. Anand Jahai is a consultant for Just Futures and the principal researcher on this project. The report that I mentioned that will be coming out before the next session was authored by Anand. We'll also be hearing from Ed Whitfield from Seed Commons, Jamie Glochet from Native Women Lead, Andrea Golden from Poder Emma, and Chris Jennings from Right to the City. So I'm going to turn it over now to Anand to do a brief recap of session 1, and then each member of our panel will have a chance to introduce their work, and then we'll do a panel style Q&A. So again, if you have questions that you want to be asked during that portion, please do make sure that you use that Q&A function to submit them. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mika. Hi, everybody. I'm Anand Jahai. I use he, him pronouns. And like Mika said, I've been supporting Just Futures with some research and helping pull together with a really awesome team this webinar series. So quickly, I just want to do a recap of the first session in case anybody missed it, or just for a refresher for people who were on that session. So a few weeks ago, we did a few things. We started off by exploring a few different but aligned frameworks for social justice investing. We had speakers from Justice Funders talking about their framework. We had a representative from the Center for Economic Democracy talking about social movement investment theory. And then we talked a little bit about Just Futures social justice investing. So I want to reiterate, there are 5 criteria that Just Futures has used for social justice investing for defining that. The first is that it needs to be led by and aligned with social justice movements. Second is that social justice investing invests in and builds power with frontline communities who have been most negatively impacted by extractive systems. Third is that it supports the development of community-controlled institutions. So those are some examples of those are worker cooperatives, community land trusts, different types of CDFIs, but also in some instances, just traditionally structured small businesses that are really locally rooted and responsive to community. The fourth criteria for social justice investing is that it embraces non-extractive terms. And so that means in practice, either low or no interest, long-term investment. So investment that's spaced out over a period of years usually. Often there's no sort of punitive mechanism that's used if a project is not successful, which means that the relationship between the investor and the investee is really built on trust and cooperation. And then finally, the fifth criteria for social justice investing is that it's accessible to ordinary community members to participate. Next, we spent a little bit of time talking about false solutions. And those were, we talked about the mainstream responsible investing world and ESG investing. And then we also talked about Robinhood and other similar projects that talk about how they're democratizing finance and creating access for the 99%, but we talked about some of the ways in which that's not actually the case. And then finally, we closed it out by, we were joined by 2 representatives from the Boston Ujima Project, which is an example of social justice investing on the ground. And we had a little bit of a conversation with them, learned about their model, their challenges and their opportunities and hopes for the future. So that's what we covered last time. This time, like Mika said, I'm really happy to be shifting into this panel where we're going to hear from 4 amazing people who are making social justice investing real on the ground in their communities, and some are operating at the national level. So the flow for today is that they'll each present for about 5 to 7 minutes. We'll have a little bit of a discussion and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So again, Mika already said this, but please make sure that you're using that Q&A function in Zoom to send in your questions as they arise. And we'll be looking through those, that Q&A tool and pulling some questions from that to pose to the panelists. So I think we're ready to jump into the panel. Again, the panelists today are going to be Jamie Gaucher from Native Women Lead, Ed Whitfield from Seed Commons, Andrea Golden from Poder Emma, and Chris Janice from Right to the City. And our first person to kick us off is going to be Jamie from Native Women Lead.
Hi, everybody. Yat Eshe Jamie Gloshe and Ashe Nakaidana Nashlas and Ajani Edas Zitlagai Bashis Chin. Hello, I'm Jamie Gloshe. I'm Navajo, White Mountain Apache, and Kiowa, zooming in today from Tiwa Territory here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm a co-founder and co-director of Native Women Lead. We're an organization that supports Indigenous women entrepreneurs and leaders, very much grassroots since 2017. Have since convened over 2,000 women representing over 200 nations, and our network is about 10,000 in the virtual world. And we have this really interesting circuitous path. We were co-founded by 8 Indigenous women, really around the big question of how do we support and not only ourselves and our families and our communities, but our nations. And that's how Native Women Lead was born. We essentially started convening our community in 2018 and 2019 with the first Native Women's Business Summit, sold out for both events, and then realized, wow, we have something here. We have a community to lean into that's representative of us. We're able to create a safe, brave, inclusive space. And it's important that we deliver culturally relevant content to our community. And initially that was it. And we had a lot to learn about ourselves. And my background, I actually used to work at a CDFI. I developed the Native American lending program at a CDFI here in the Southwest, really trying to figure out how do I get more dollars into the hands of Native entrepreneurs, and was running into challenges, not only within the institution, but also seeing what challenges on the ground those entrepreneurs were facing in accessing capital. And I'll go a little more into that in just a second, but if you could please advance to the next slide. Or is that me? Okay. So who are we? Native women, we really kind of took a look at ourselves and said, essentially what makes us different as Indigenous women entrepreneurs. And a big part of it is we carry our culture and our community with us in all the decisions we make and all the things that we do. But in further, I guess, introspection and research, 2/3 of us are the primary breadwinners. We're not only I always say the breadwinners, but we're also the bread makers. And we're essentially the key economic stabilizers in our communities. We're highly invisible. We represent less than 1% of the population. Therefore, we are facing erasure. We also face a lot of negative stereotypes about our communities and high rates of violence. Nearly 1 in 3 of us will experience violence in our lifetime, according to the National Institute on Justice. However, 5-minute warning, thank you. Our trajectory, we're growing businesses twice as fast as any other demographic, and we have a ripple effect on our community. Next slide. Okay, so what we're doing is we're actually piloting a really cool lending/investment, I guess, pathway. It's called the Matriarch Funds. We are looking at relationship-based lending for Native women entrepreneurs. It's designed for Native women by Native women, specifically with a gender and matriarchal lens. We actually are introducing our 5 R's of rematriation framework, and we assert that decision-making from the design all the way to the decision-making of who gets funded is held by us. And really this process was really made to protect Native women, to mitigate racial and gender bias that exists in financial systems. So we're actually challenging the 5 C's of credit that I'm conditioned, and I think a lot of folks know how that works. We're challenging that because we're seeing that it's often rooted in capitalism and patriarchy, and it's been incredibly exclusionary for our people. Next slide, please. Proving Native women are investable. Next slide. Matriarch Funds, it's essentially a holistic approach. So we're providing community, capital, technical assistance, coaching and mentorship, as well as loan forgiveness. We actually have 3 funds currently in operation. The Response Fund, we were launching that at the height of the pandemic. We didn't feel comfortable about giving our community debt. We actually got some money through our Friends at Indian Collective, and we passed that through to our community, and we wove in 50% loan forgiveness. To date, we've funded 35 entrepreneurs. Nearly 40% of the cohort have paid off. We have a 99% repayment rate, and that's supported by Nusenda, who does our back office operations. Next slide. And quickly, we also have our Creative Fund, which is another fund we launched early this year. It's $150,000. We're funding 20 creative entrepreneurs, microfinance with Nusenda as well. Interest rates for all of these funds range anywhere from 0 to 5%. And recently, we just launched our Restorative Fund in partnership with Common Future and Community Credit Lab. That's a $250,000 fund. We're funding 7 women entrepreneurs. Some of them are therapists, nurse practitioners, beauty, consultants, capacity building folks. And our goals are to launch a revolutionary fund, which is a $10 million fund. All of that's to be determined. We're in design, but we're using these 5 R's of rematriation in our underwriting and decision-making criteria. Next slide. And I'll close it up in just a second. Yeah, this is just a comparison of what I shared earlier. So you can go to the next slide as well. We're collecting a lot of data information for our community, kind of get a sense of where they're at. But in the future, if you want to go to the next slide, we actually are looking at other impact metrics as it results to our fund. So one, we want to know, is this model sustainable? Do wraparound supports provide better results? Is relationship-based lending effective? Can this capital be catalytic? And is culture, family, and community a risk mitigator? Next slide. I told you a little bit about a lot of the resources that we provide. It's a holistic approach to honoring and supporting Indigenous women at the center. And next slide. This is just one strategy of our ultimate ecosystem strategy approach that we're taking. So just to kind of give you all a sense of the worldview and how we see the world and problem solvings and solutions, we've actually created an ecosystem, a waterway actually to support Indigenous women. We don't say pipelines, but we're actually looking at impact metrics around empowerment, agency, healing, safety, sovereignty, rematriation, while building out an ecosystem that provides capital, community, Indigenous enhanced metrics on evaluation as well as impact, and building out a fund fellowship to ensure that there's representation of Indigenous women in the field. Thank you. I think that's it. I think I'm done. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That was great to hear about that relationship-based lending frame that y'all are using. And also that using a relationship-based lending strategy is leading to that 99% repayment rate. That's really exciting and powerful to hear. I'm going to pass it off next to Ed Whitfield from Seed Commons, who I know uses a similar frame to their work. So Ed, you can take it away.
It's best to unmute and turn on the camera. I finally figured this out. Thank you very much. And I'm really happy to be here and want to share a little bit for a few minutes about Seed Commons. Seed Commons technically kind of began in 2015, but it grew out of work that had started in about 2004 in Argentina, where one of our leaders, Brendan Martin, was there to support the Recovered Factories movement and started helping with lending into groups of workers whose factories have been closed down due to the economic crisis there in Argentina. And growing out of this, he found that people, became really solid partners in the course of the work of trying to rebuild their economy, but also in the course of trying to help others to rebuild the economy. So the whole approach of people collectively working together to build cooperative movements, and particularly worker-owned co-op movements, was a part of a model that he ended up bringing back to the United States, and first doing it in New York, but then seeing a demand all across the country for it, and not wanting to build a strong centralized organization, instead helped us build this network of local loan funds. So at this point in 2022, Seed Commons is made up of a network of more than 31 local loan funds across the country. Most of them are highly localized in their community, with about $20 million in capital that is currently deployed to cooperatives and affecting over 14,000 workers that are impacted by the loans we've made. 92% of our portfolio is invested in Black or people of color owned business enterprises, with 63% of those being led by women, queer, and transgender people. And during the pandemic, we were able to allocate about $7 million in resources. And knock on wood, none of the businesses that we have supported directly have closed as a factor of the pandemic. I say knock on wood because there's one that's having some difficulties now. We're going to continue to work with that. But overall, all the businesses we work with remain open during the pandemic. The essence of Seed Commons' approach is one that's caught up in three things I like to talk about. One is it is inclusive in a way that we make loan funds available to people who traditional lending institutions would absolutely ignore. The 5 C's of credit that we just heard about, will find ways to eliminate from contention many of the people that we would lend to. So it's inclusive. It's also productive. We're concerned with expanding people's opportunities to be productive, not just redistribution of existing resources, but recognizing that people are typically capable of producing value to meet their needs and elevate the quality of life. So we see doing this as a key to moving our work forward. The other is that we're non-extractive, which is to say that if you borrow from us, you don't have to pay the money back unless the business activity that you're engaged with actually returns you a profit and is productive. So that along with collateral requirements and some other things we can talk about very specifically, make our lending process a very non-extractive process, so that our aim is that no one who borrows from us will be made worse off for having done so, even if the particular enterprise that they engage with fails. But part of our work also is to provide large amounts of technical assistance to try to make sure that those enterprises do not fail. Our work is a combination of providing both the resources and the information needed for successful work in communities that allow communities to build toward the self-reliance that they so deserve, need, and desire in the world. And with that, I'm going to leave it for now. One of the groups we work with is going to also be talking. Poder Emma is part of Seed Commons, as is Right to the City, and you're going to be hearing a little bit more about the work we do.
Thanks so much for that, Ed. Yeah, we're going to stay in Seed Commons land for a little bit. Our next speaker is going to be Andrea Golden from Poder Emma, which is a Seed Commons member. And so she'll be able to share a little bit about how some of that work is looking in a specific locale. Go ahead, Andrea.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. It's raining kind of hard here. My name is Andrea Golden. I work with an organization called Poder Emma Community Ownership, which is located right outside of Asheville, North Carolina, which is the western part of the state. And I want to tell you a little bit about our community before I talk about our work. So the Emma community is a neighborhood. It's about 4 square miles, so we're talking about a very specific place. There's about 3,000 households in our neighborhood, and it's one of the most diverse both racially and linguistically neighborhoods in all of Western North Carolina. There's quite a large immigrant community from across Latin America. And another important thing to know about our community is we're about 40% mobile homes in terms of the housing that we live in. So that's a little bit about the place. When we talk about Emma, that's Emma. If you could go to the next slide. And a little bit of our history. Poder Emma as an organization has only been around for 5 years, but we've been doing this work for over 20 years in our region. And so I think where we came from is a really important part of why we do what we're doing now. There was an organization that about 2 decades ago worked to build a lot of grassroots infrastructure in Western North Carolina. It's called the Center for Participatory Change. And our relationship with them and with the Highlander Research and Education Center in East Tennessee was really critical to our formation. CPC teaching us how to build infrastructure, and Highlander really training us in popular education, language justice practices, community organizing. So we were fortunate enough to have access to this movement building support, and for many, many years really focused on the crisis point that our community was facing, which was around immigrant rights. And so we worked for many years to form rapid response networks to keep communities safe during things like license checkpoints and ICE enforcement activities. And that was really critical because it taught our community that when we came together and focused on concrete change, we could achieve it. And I don't know that we'd be doing economic organizing had we not first focused on building that concrete belief in collective action for concrete change. If you want to go to the next slide. And so Poder Emma was formed because after years of focusing on rapid response and immigrant rights, our community started to feel the impacts of another crisis, which was the housing crisis. If you've heard of Asheville, North Carolina, there is a lot of development. It's a very popular destination, and it's really changed the landscape of the place that we live in. And so we started to focus on stopping gentrification and displacement of our community. We have two ways that we do that. One is community-led development. We have a strong member base with hundreds of families in our neighborhood that work together for positive public policy to protect affordable housing and stop displacement. And the other way that we do that is through cooperative development, which is what I'll be sharing more about today. The next slide. And so we support 4 different kinds of cooperatives in our neighborhood. A significant amount of our work is around the creation of mobile home park cooperatives. And we have 3 currently in our network that together have created 43 units of permanently affordable, dignified, and community-owned housing. And this model really allows the community to pull the real estate off of the speculative market, permanently protect it, and allow families like mine, I live in one of the co-ops, to build financial equity, which is just a huge change to go from a lifelong tenant where you have not built any savings for your family into being able to build this equity. So that's a large part of our work. And next slide. Another kind of cooperative that we work to develop are real estate investment cooperatives. The first one that we work to form is called La Esperanza. That's the building. Our office is located there, as well as a vast network of other grassroots groups and worker-owned businesses. And the Community Real Estate Investment Co-op works to protect commercial properties and land in our neighborhood so that they're not vulnerable to being redeveloped by outside investors, and making sure that the space is used in alignment of community need. So currently we have our community space with offices and gathering, and a community developed park. The next slide. Another kind of co-op that we work to cultivate are worker-owned businesses. There are currently 4 in our network. We have Chispas Property Maintenance, Quetzal Community Real Estate, Power and Numbers Bookkeeping, Sensone Language Justice Cooperative, and La Bugambilia, which is a preschool, after school, and summer camp that provides instruction in Spanish, as well as visiting teachers that teach Ñañu, which is a Mexican indigenous language that is spoken in our neighborhood. And with the worker co-ops, we really work to both help start and then support the ongoing development of businesses that meet our community's needs, our cooperative ecosystems needs, and then look to connect to the wider market for scalability. And the next slide. And the last kind of cooperative that we work to form are early childhood educator shared services cooperative. In our community, childcare and early childhood education is so critical. It's what allows our parents to go to work and allows our kids to be in safe places that recognize who they are and supports them in our development. The most common form of childcare and early childhood education is neighbors watching each other's kids for us in our neighborhood. And so that often ends up meaning that people are exempt from licensing and excluded from professional development and support. So we support this kind of cooperative that works with women in our neighborhood to get access to that training and to provide culturally and linguistically relevant care. So those are the 4 kinds of co-ops. And the way that we do that, and you can stop the slide, that's the last slide. In my last minute, I'll just share, we've pulled all of our co-ops together in a cooperative of cooperatives. And through that, we provide technical assistance, shared trainings in things like HR, supervision, open book management. We all share our policy and practices development because it's so much more sustainable to grow and learn and implement together than each co-op out there on their own. We share legal counsel, bookkeeping, CPAs, and backend services. And of course, we share our lending. So Poder Dema lends via Seed Commons, which for us was the game changer, because for decades, we've been doing everything on our own with the resources that we had as a community. And once we were able to access capital, we've been able to invest in the last 4 years over $2 million in our community, all of which is in successful active repayment. So that's Poder Dema. Thank you so much.
Andrea, thank you so much. I always love hearing about Poder Dema's work, and I think it leads really well into our next speaker, Chris, Janice from Right to the City, because Right to the City, I think, has been on a similar trajectory of being rooted in organizing, and especially around housing and anti-displacement work, moving into work around community control of housing and land. So Chris, I'll pass it to you to close out this presentation portion.
Cool, thanks, Anand. Hey folks, hope everybody's doing well. Glad to see so many people join the webinar today. So my name is Chris Janice, and I live on Piscataway and Natchez land, otherwise known as Washington, DC, and I'm a staff member with Right to the City. So for folks who don't know who we are, we're a national alliance of over 90 housing and land justice organizations from across the country. And as an alliance, we're united with a strong vision to halt gentrification and displacement, decommodify land and housing, and create democratic, just, and sustainable communities. Now, through decades of collective organizing, we've come to the assessment that tenant organizing, while necessary, needs to move beyond fights that just stop evictions or prevent rent increases. Now, again, while those are things that stop the bleeding now, they address immediate crises that many in our community are facing. Fundamentally, even when we win those, the capitalist structures that cause displacement and wealth extraction and cause things like evictions or rent increases, all of those things are still in place. And so we need to take it a step further by getting community control of land and housing. So at Right to the City, I lead a team called the Community Land Liberation Team, and we're tasked with doing exactly that. So we're developing the base building, legislative, and financing strategies to move 1 million acres of land land and housing off the speculative market in the next 10 years, and then to put that land into permanent community control in the form of community land trust and housing cooperatives. So one of the big components of the work that we're doing is we're developing a Right to the City National Loan Fund in partnership with C Commons. And that's to provide the financing that our communities are going to need to make that a reality. So our loan fund is going to be democratically governed by our members, many of whom are tenant associations, all of whom are doing housing justice work. And these members will collectively set the loan terms, review loan applications, and ultimately decide how the resources will be distributed. Now, in the very long term, we're going to need hundreds of millions of dollars in this loan fund for it to actually be able to take all the land and housing off the speculative market that we need to take off of it. But in the near term, our hope is to launch the loan fund this year with $2 million in capital to be used in the first round of lending, and then to raise another $5 million in capital for the loan fund second year. So I want to give a couple of examples of key projects. And the first one is really exciting. It's actually something that just mostly wrapped up this morning. So while our loan fund isn't up and running, we actually just closed our first mortgage and helped one of our members, Smash in Miami, to actually take a home and land off the speculative market. So a little background on that story. So they're organizing a housing cooperative of 5 volunteer organizers, all of whom are Black and brown women. And we're coming together to live together collectively and then build the base and lead campaigns in the Miami area and Florida more broadly. So Smash was actually going to rent a house to start this cooperative because they didn't have the funds, but they found out their landlord was selling the property shortly after signing the lease with them. So rather than just let it go to some other real estate speculator and have them be evicted, even if they were current on rent, they decided to try to put the funds together to actually purchase the home and to take it off the speculative market permanently. So they were pre-approved for some financing, but it wasn't going to kick in for 90 days. So what we did is we issued a 90-day bridge loan of $465,000 to close the deal now. And that was after a lot of deliberation with over 20 of our members in various committees, our translocal organizing committees, our committee that's incubating and thinking about the loan fund, and our board of directors. And through all of that, we decided to issue this 0% bridge loan for the full amount to Smash in order for them to take that home off the speculative market. So this is going to be the first co-op that's Smash is operating in the first CLT in the Miami area. Really, really excited about that. So this is just like one example of many, many others. Inquilinos Unidos in Minneapolis, they organized to evict their landlord. They currently have community control over 5 buildings that they're turning into a co-op for which they need financing. 9 to 5 Colorado, similar to Poder Emma, is mobilizing residents and is organizing residents in mobile home parks. And they're trying to stop the sale and the displacement of those residents and get community control of their homes and land. Chainbreaker in New Mexico, they're trying to stop Netflix from coming in and taking a big swath of land right in the middle of the community they're organizing. Jane Place in New Orleans, Citywide Tenant Union Rochester, the list goes on and on and on and on. So we're really excited about where this work is going. Every day we're seeing opportunities pop up for us to get land and housing off the speculative market through a variety of different ways, organizing things coming up like just onto the market and that we can take off, and then even like some legislative approaches. But we're also really excited that like we're not in this movement alone, that there's other movements, other sectors of the broader social justice movement with similarly minded people who are using financing and investing tools to create new pathways and strategies for our communities to attain liberation. So I think that's my time for the presentation. Just want to say thank you so much all for coming. Thank you to Just Futures and Justice Funders for inviting us. Appreciate y'all.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chris. And thanks to all of our panelists. We're gonna, and congrats on that first mortgage. That's awesome. I'm seeing y'all getting some love in the chat. So congrats on that. We're gonna transition into the little bit of discussion, Q&A portion. So I have a few questions and then I see that there have been some questions dropped into the Q&A function in Zoom, but I would encourage, again, people who are watching, if you have questions for the panelists, drop those into the Q&A tool. So my first question is for Ed, and I think, it's fitting that we just heard from Chris, they're talking about taking 1 million acres of land off the speculative market in the next 10 years, I think you said, Chris. So Ed, my first question is for you. It's just, what do you say to people who say that social justice investing is not scalable?
I hear a lot about scalability. And so there are a couple of things going on. One is that the work we're doing is embryonic right now. We are building at a small scale. We're educating people. We're helping communities develop cores of people within those communities that have an idea of a different kind of world that can be built in the future, a better world. So hopefully, as the crisis intensifies, rather than it just generating despair, it can also point people towards some models that they're able to make use of. And we do see economic crises looming. There are regularly signs of it. It happens in an unequal kind of pace. So there's some communities that are already in crises by virtue of the lack of jobs, the lack of opportunities. There are other communities that will more be in that situation. So what we're looking for is, one, to build the embryo with the information and some resources in it and help train a group of people who will then be able to share these things more broadly. The other thing that concerns me, though, is that sometimes the question of scale is raised by the very people who have access to the resources that, if more of them were deployed, would allow us to scale up more quickly. So that if indeed you don't feel that there's enough cooperative activity taking place, help us with it. We're doing what we can with the resources that we have right now. We need more. I know a number of people were asking about opportunities. There are teams within Seed Commons that are responsible for investments and fundraising, both of which we need because we support the people who are active in the field doing this work, as well as wanting to have access to capital to deploy. So we're looking forward to expand that way. But we don't think that caterpillars don't scale into butterflies. They die a horrid death as they wrap themselves in a cocoon, and then this beautiful butterfly emerges out of it. So we're looking to continue to do the work within our small embryonic work, so that we will be the caterpillars of the future butterflies of the economy that we're going to be growing. And that won't be a linear process at all. And we're, kind of happy to be in the role that we are, at the point we are, but needing more resources to continue this moving forward.
Thank you for that, Ed. I wanted to open that question up to other panelists to see if you had anything to add. As I was doing research for Just Futures, I was hearing two different things. I was hearing from people on the investing side that a lot of these social justice funds aren't ready for like large scale investment for various reasons. And then I heard from people like Ed was just saying, who are doing the work with the funds, saying that it's more so that investors aren't willing to invest larger sums. So I'm curious if any of y'all have anything else to add on that question of scale.
I think for me, that's not the first goal. While we'd love to share our model with across communities of color and to show that we are not risky people, we actually are worthy of investment. So scaling isn't like one of our priorities at this point. It's actually changing and challenging the system while we're working in it. So I'll just add that.
I'd like to add for us, we're intentionally a neighborhood-based organization because our cooperative development is so tied to community organizing, and that's what we've done for many years. For us, the way that we were able to contribute to scale, although I totally agree with Jamie that that's not been our primary focus, but the way that we've connected is by joining Seed Commons, where together lots of organizations like ours who have particular geographic scopes can then work together to create investment funds that are really able to move significant amounts of capital. We really believe that as a community, doing something small, learning about it, and then taking the next step has been what's allowed us to grow so much over the past 20 years and really encourage other communities to focus on what it is that your community needs and then find that strength by joining other communities.
Andrea, if we could stick with you for a minute, because you just touched on something that I think was really important about, y'all are operating at a certain scale because you're very tied to the community. You're very rooted in community. So, and you touched on this in your presentation that Poder Emerson Loan Fund grew out of organizing around immigrant rights. So I'm curious if you could share if there are ways that you feel like that foundation has made the investment work stronger.
I think so, for sure. I imagine it's similar to people that do place-based organizing and what that leads them to around the country. So for us, because we were focused on where we live and the issue that was hitting us hardest was immigrant rights at that time. I think place-based organizing, it's based in relationship. It's extended families and neighbors and people with generational ties. And so that there are informal trust networks that then organizers go in to build infrastructure around. And I think that that's been so critical to us. And I think achieving concrete wins, like people being able to get home more safely at the end of the day, that's what cultivated a belief in collective action. So even when you're working 2-3 jobs, even when life is just feeling like there's so much to bear, once you've experienced that win, you bind together with your neighbors and you can change, it creates this belief and commitment that we can change anything. And I think that that was so critical. And then the third piece to it, I think, is that it's cultural organizing. It is financial organizing. It is building cooperatives to change our economic condition, but it's built on our culture. So both Appalachian culture and the culture of immigrant communities that believe in interconnectedness, that believe in intergenerational vision, and that have cultural and cooperative practices that people have been engaged in as families and neighborhoods for generations and generations.
Awesome, thank you, Andrea. This next question is for all of y'all, whoever wants to answer. But I'm curious about how you go about attracting investors, and if investors can be earning or making larger returns in more traditional markets. How do you make the pitch to investors that this is where they should be directing some of their investment dollars?
I'll start, and then I'm sure everybody has something to say about this. Our work is rooted in values. And if the value is simply the largest return on your capital, then our values clash, because our values are rooted in the values of community, where maximizing profit at the expense of people is seen as not a positive thing that we would want to promote. There has been a myth in the investor world for some time, you can get just as big a profit return on investing in social justice ventures as you can on other stuff. And this is largely not true. Because if that were true, that would mean that capitalists as people are just simply evil, because they could have been making as much or more money doing good stuff, and instead they've done all these atrocious things through history. No. The logic of capital drives itself toward forcing down wages, charging high prices, and basically eating up people in order to maintain and magnify capital. So we're not a good fit for that. There are, though, investors who have values. There are people who are the inheritors of wealth. There are people who have engaged in profitable activities and are wanting to give back, to pay forward into community. Those are the people we want to attract. And the truth of the matter is that no, you will not make as much money doing this as you will the most dastardly evil stuff that you can come up with. But then you will be able to sleep at night.
Real quick, before anybody else jumps in on that, we had a question from the audience that's connected to this. Somebody was asking if y'all could specify if there are specific opportunities to donate or invest in your funds. So as you answer, Ed, do you want to respond to that? And then
we have a team at Seed Commons that engages in investor relations. As you all know, that the security regulations around investing mean that not everybody goes out and solicits investors. That doesn't work in this country without you going to jail. So we do have a team there. We'd love to hear from you. If there are investment things that you think that you are interested in, please contact us. At our website is pretty widely available, and our investor team would be right involved with it. And we're hoping that we can help find part of the $200 to $100 billion that's going to be required for Chris and the rights of the city to do what their aim is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're open to support from philanthropic or investment support, as well as we're building out our fund. And I have to agree with Ed. For us, it's around values and vision alignment. Just by nature, our community defines wealth very differently. It's not just what's your net worth, what's your profit, what assets are you sitting on. It's actually defined of, do we have access to our ancestral homelands? Are our children healthy? Do we have clean water? That's like our definition of wealth. How much actually can we give back to our community? So it's I think there's this tension in like worldview. So we're looking definitely for investors that are values and vision aligned, but also are willing to go beyond the traditional ROI. And I always use the example for me when I think about Indigenous women, that 1 in 3 of us will experience violence in our lifetime. What's the measure of safety, and how do you measure that, and how do you value that? An Indigenous woman's life and safety for a year, 2 years, for her lifetime, that to me is immeasurable and invaluable, but it's also, I think, something that I want to invest in, and something that I think is impactful.
Yeah, I just also want to triple that. I mean, for us, like, we can't make the math work in a way that is accessible to our communities without folks on the investor side, or just even folks like donating gift capital to these funds, like giving things like being able to issue loans that are either 0 interest or very low interest or below market, like necessitates us like being able to on the investor side, not like give returns that you would get if you were trying to invest in mortgage-backed securities or some other like financial product. What I would say in terms of for us, we like are still kind of in, even though we gave out like we issued our first mortgage today, we're still in a very kind of like incubation phase and are looking at this first year, like we're still figuring out some stuff structurally, but we think that at least for us, Ed said that there's a whole bunch of security like and compliance regulatory stuff that we need to figure out. But we also need to figure out just a whole bunch of other stuff on like our decision-making process, like how to actually like work with members that haven't like necessarily taken out a mortgage before or like acquired land. And like, there's a whole bunch of things that we're trying to figure out. So I think for us in the first year, it's really like, we're going to be looking for gift capital and then like scaling up from there. And hopefully opening up for investors in the next 2 years or something like that. What I would say is if folks are interested in learning more, we are hosting a briefing in the middle of July. The date's kind of escaping me right now, but that's going to be like the place where we'll start to just kind of gauge like interest from folks.
Can I just name something here? I was going to put it in the chat, and I'll just share it now. But, we're in this squishy space of piloting and developing proof of concept, which is also, like, I would say, like funder investor requirement to show that and to prove that we're not risking, to prove that this stuff works and to prove it's scalable and sustainable. But what's always like the weird tension for myself, especially as an Indigenous person, is that the wealth, as was named early, was already stolen and taken. So it's like, we're now trying to prove that we're worthy of getting back the wealth that was taken from us. Like, I just want to name that.
There's another point I'd like to make, which is that we are taught every day to seek out individual solutions to these collectively generated problems. And we have to learn, that's why I think the point that Jamie is making is so important, that there have to be examples. The point that Andrea was making, there have to be these examples that you create to build trust and build relationships between people. In the absence of that, none of the rest of this stuff actually works. And so it is that organizing task of building trust, which is again why what Jamie was saying about, the first priority isn't to see how big you can get, but it's to see how far you can push the values that are very, very important into the future, so that those values, rather than scale and size, are the features that are most highly elevated. And so we don't want to grow faster than our capacity to do good work in the field. That would be worse than what we have. But we can do a lot more because the needs are so great. The needs are incredibly great.
So my next question is for Jamie and Chris. And Jamie, you just already started getting into this, so I don't know if you were setting me up for a segue, but you were doing it. Y'all are both in the process of either getting funds up off the ground or just in the very early stages of that work. So I'm curious if you could share what are some of the challenges or big questions that you're grappling with right now.
I think as a grassroots organization, and the expectation I think that women of color and people of color have to hold is you have to be the expert of everything, and I cannot. So we're running into capacity. And what's been great about the models that we've been able to pilot and scale and work with, especially with New Center Credit Union, which is also a CDFI, and Common Feature and Community Credit Lab, is we don't have to carry that burden of becoming a financial intermediary and go through that legal, like that whole like circuitous pathway, right? And becoming legit. Like, we actually can work with a trusted partner that does have that expertise so that we can focus on the work. So that's definitely been, I think, just the learning journey for us. And as folks are like, become a CDFI, become a charitable loan fund, become this, do this. We actually, in the interest of our community and the need and the way that we're trying to do this, is we want to do this in a very strategic way, but also understand like we carry so much burden anyway. We're mobilizing our nation. So holding it down for our families. We're the economic stabilizers. Like, how much more do we have to prove, and how much more do we have to hold in order to do this work? So that's been one challenge. And then just the legal, I guess, expertise, definitely. So that like the financial and the legal expertise is something that I think is one of the challenges and barriers is that we're navigating through.
Yeah, I really resonate with all those things. I think to say some things for us, there's a lot of challenges, but one of like the big things to name is just like with like land and housing, the like scale of capital is so much. Like, and I mean, Andrea, I'm really curious to hear like kind of your take on this, but like, you know, for us, it feels like even with this first loan, which is a 90-day loan, there's pre-approved financing, like we're pretty confident and have like contingency plans based on top of contingency plans. It still feels like it's so consequential because like it's so much resources, and those are the like this was of the capital needs of any of our members, one of the smaller, if not the smallest one that came to us. You know, we had a member that kind of separately, they put together a $20 million offer for a mobile home park and got turned down because the landowner wanted 40. And it's just, you know, it's like the things that we're kind of like competing with in this market. I mean, they're not built for community. Like they're built for speculators and capitalists. And so I think like that's like a really huge challenge. And then, you know, I think the other thing is like almost, you know, even if we're like incubating this fund and we have like we have like a wealth of like experience and knowledge, like both within Right to the City itself and then like among our alliance members too. I think that there's just a reality that like a lot of the groups that are popping up, you know, like are very new groups that like the traditional market, like they can't find financing in other places because like they've only been like an official legalized entity for a couple months, you know. And so like figuring out ways both like how can we provide like the capital for those kind of groups and then like open up doors because like we're not going to be able to service all of the capital needs of every single member, and that they are going to have to find some capital from like other resources. But what about those groups that like, you know, was just a group of 5 like neighbors that organized to evict their landlord, right? Like, and then they formed an organization and they have no credit history. So like we're figuring out all that stuff too. Like that's going to be a really big challenge that like we are seeing. We're not like diving into yet, but like we know is going to be in the offing for us.
Thanks, y'all. This is my last question, and then we'll shift to audience Q&A. But my last one is for all of y'all. But you've all prioritized doing this social justice investing work in various marginalized communities. And so I'm curious if you could share ways that you've seen this work really positively impact those communities.
I'll start, just break the silence here. It's in the communities where our folk are working, it brings a measure of hope. Some communities right now are what I call in season for investors and philanthropy because, you know, growing from some of the tragedies of the last many years, well, tragedies that people know about by virtue of cell phones that have been going on for a very long time. But there are a lot of communities that some folks are reaching out to. But not all of this is done in such a way as to build a self-reliance and capacity of those communities to continue to move forward after we're not in season, you know, after we're not kind of the next hottest thing to do. So we're trying to look at this in the long run of what's going to move our communities forward for years and years into the future. And we think that the kind of work that builds on self-reliance, builds on hope, builds on collective interest, builds on the need for people to organize with each other to build power, that these are the things that are key to it. And our work tries to center itself around engaging in that kind of way. And so in those communities where we're breaking through, making beginning things, we're creating hope because people are seeing folks that they never thought would be able to successfully get a business up and operating. They're seeing them beginning to do so. And we're hoping that hope will spread rapidly.
Thanks, Ed. For me, what I'm seeing with, I think, other models and our model is it's community centered and also community led. I think that has it validates internally within our community the need, as well as it allows us to develop these quick feedback loops to be connected and build that trust with community. Decision making for our fund is definitely woven in community as well. We have it made up of Native women entrepreneurial organizations that can chime in, Native women entrepreneurs, as well as co-founders. And we've actually been able to weave our decision criteria through our values, so that, and also I think helps us continue to uplift and keep those values intact. It also takes a strong financial partner just to help with that, I guess, that carrying that burden and that responsibility. It was phenomenal when we were working with Nusenda to say they have $3 billion in assets. So we're not messing around, and they've actually scaled the Co-op Capital program, which we initially have started in to a $4.5 million fund. And I think there's a 98% repayment rate, and they've funded like 500 entrepreneurs at this point, including Black and immigrant entrepreneurs as well, to prove that we are not risky. And then last, I think it's an expansion of that mindset of what impact metrics are, to my example around safety, and the acknowledgement that the burden of risk should actually be on funders as well as investors, and not just on us.
I mean, I can say I've learned so many lessons about the impact in our community of the work over the past couple of decades, but one of the projects that we're involved with that has just given me so much learning is one of the newest co-ops that we work with, which is the largest mobile home park in our network. You know, and there are neighbors there that have been tenants for 20, 30 years. It's a multiracial neighborhood of white, Black, and Latino people. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before, who are on complete opposite ends of the political spectrum. And through coming together to learn about how to form a cooperative and to create dignified housing in a place where people have been living in incredibly substandard conditions for many, many years, has been so transformative for people's lives and for the relationship amongst neighbors who at one point would have never been in a trusting relationship together. And so for me, one of the impacts is looking at all of the levels of transformation when a community sets out to meet its own needs in a way that matches our realities. I think it's incredibly transformative. And once you see that something else is possible, your imagination doesn't stop there. I think you start to reimagine so many aspects of your life and know that your community can build it for itself. I think that's just an incredible impact.
And so to say one example of, I guess, where it hasn't worked and then one where it has. So I was I used to live in Seattle, and I was organizing homeowners on the precipice of foreclosure eviction. We were able to put pressure and renegotiate loan modifications with 3 banks and keep 3 people in their homes. And all 3 of those people, unfortunately, or excuse me, 2 of the 3 of those people, unfortunately, fell back into foreclosure later and ultimately lost their homes. And it was because they didn't fundamentally have community control over their land and home. They were still in that same problematic relationship with the same financial institution that was forcing them into that moment of crisis anyways. In contrast, our member Citywide Tenant Union of Rochester was birthed out of organizing during the foreclosure crisis. They started a community land trust, and all the organizing that they did to prevent foreclosure evictions of their members, any home that they were able to put pressure on the bank, they put into that community land trust, and all the folks are still living in those homes. So, for us, this is a really key and important part of why like anti-eviction organizing needs to end in community control, and why social justice investing in things like the loan fund are really important for that.
Awesome, thanks y'all. We have some questions from the audience, so I'm gonna shift into those. The first one is asking if there are specific projects or opportunities that are focused on young people, specifically young people under 25, particularly when it comes to organizing, training, and education, political education, and or their experiences as workers, and their more long-term visioning.
I mean, I put in the chat, but I can say, briefly here, we do focus on working with young people in terms of prepping their skill sets to join the worker cooperatives. And so we have a program for young people ages 14 to 19 who probably have been the babysitters for their families and neighbors their entire lives, and now are getting trained in the profession of early childhood education so they can then move into the co-op. And we've also set up mentorship and scholarship programs for young people to train in things like bookkeeping, real estate, interpretation and translation, so that we can make sure that we're building the skill sets to then help our cooperatives grow and build opportunities for young people to stay in our region instead of thinking that they have to leave to find a better future.
So thank you, Andrea. Our next question is asking about doing this sort of work outside of the US. The question is, do you have advice for developing social justice investment vehicles with social movements outside of the US?
I am not an expert by any means, but there is a need to do that. I actually am learning about the work of ECMIA. They're a coalition of 23 countries, primarily represented by Indigenous women, who are looking at addressing violence of Indigenous women across the Americas. So there's emergent work, but I think what we can prove with these models here in the US could also have impact internationally as well. Because I know like the US is often looked at as, the place to test and design, but I'm not too yeah, so that's my 2 cents.
I mean, Seed Commons roots are in Latin America. So we still have active groups that are part of our organization in Argentina and Nicaragua. So, we're certainly aware of that and think it's really, really important. And it's just really sad to think that people think you can solve the problems in the United States that are indeed worldwide problems. There are other kinds of groups like William DeVere that, and some other groups that do work in Africa and Latin America and many places in the Caribbean. So there's a lot of other work going on. I don't know that I have any advice for people who are looking into doing that. There are certainly some complications that grow out of international transfers of money, and the various legalities. So I would hope that people, try to make sure that their work is done on very, very strong legal footing, just to avoid the pitfalls of spending your time in a free ed movements aren't all that much fun. So I would much rather us get some legal advice first.
Yeah, I'm not a panelist, but I would hop in on this one and just say that I don't know necessarily much about loan funds specifically outside of the US, but a lot of solidarity economy work, cooperative work is, frankly, it's just a lot more developed outside of the US than it is in the US. And I think organizers doing it here get a lot of inspiration from people doing it abroad, and especially in the global South. Like Ed was saying, Seed Commons grew out of Latin America. And yeah, I think that often in places where there's still a strong indigenous presence and indigenous culture, those practices, those cooperative practices haven't been wiped out to the extent that they have been here. And so it's a little bit easier to build upon those cultures of just cooperation and solidarity that already exist. We have a question. Okay. Are there any values aligned and affordable consultants who are able to provide financial and legal support to projects getting off the ground? And do any of your organizations offer this?
We are working with potentially mission-driven finance. Sankofa has really been helpful in their modeling, and then participating in a fellowship with Purpose Foundation, the Futurist Fellowship. So that's been really helpful in our education. I don't know if that was the question, but we know there's expertise and experience out there, and we were definitely looking for partners that are aligned with these vision and values of ours to push that conversation around economic justice.
And I would just share, we've struggled with similar questions. You know, in our region, it was hard for us to find technical assistance and support that was accessible, both price and language, but also understood the context that we were working in. So it's not to say that it's not out there, but what we, you know, really dedicated ourselves to was building it for ourselves from the ground up, you know, training ourselves in areas, looking for mentorship regionally and nationally, but training up our own people as local technical assistance providers who then can provide across the entire network to all of our cooperatives. So we've really taken kind of a long haul approach of finding trusted people and then training up internally to ensure that that can kind of live here locally.
I'd like to say something about the model that has been built with Poder Emma's work. They have been systematic about taking things that anybody learns and bringing it back into the collective community and doing extensive work. And I mean hours and hours of training and work. These are some of the meetingest people in the world, and they're also holding out other often full-time jobs and stuff. And you have to just really respect that this is, again, rooted in the trust that was built in that organizing work for people's safety that have allowed them to build this kind of cohesive network of people who feel a responsibility to share knowledge and tools and resources with each other in order to move the whole community forward. They are such a beautiful example of what is possible in that regard.
And Ed, I know Seed Commons does a bunch of technical assistance and that sort of work. Is that primarily with Seed Commons members, or do y'all do that work with non-members as well?
We will periodically get calls from people who are outside of our network asking, you know, if we can talk through with them something, and we respond. I mean, we answer them. You know, I have some scheduled on my calendar now, some calls with some people who are not part of our network. Most of our technical assistance work is with people who are currently in the network. And more than that, we look forward to drawing people who are not in our network yet into the network in order to get that kind of assistance available on a more systematic basis. So hopefully out of some of the relationships we build with some people who are not yet part of us, they will be soon. And we won't be talking about 31 loan funds. We'll be talking about 51 or 71 as our capacity to satisfy and build and train with people, you know, expands and grows. But yeah, we get some of that regularly. It challenges our capacity to be able to do it on an ongoing way, but you know, we're looking to grow.
Thanks, y'all. I know that this was answered in the chat in the Q&A, but I did want to bring it to the full group and open it up a little bit. So we had a question specifically about, aren't there cities without land trust laws, and how do you organize and capture land in those situations? I thought maybe we could broaden that a little bit and just talk about how, you know, as y'all have been talking about, the kind of policy legislative system in this country wasn't established for people to build really cooperative economies. So I'm wondering if you can talk about strategies that y'all have used when you run into either like legal barriers or just kind of legal gaps.
I'll be done after I say this. The key to this is creativity. you got to understand that the work even in Western North Carolina isn't on a formal community land trust basis. It was the creative work of a group of people in community who identified a problem and sought out a solution to it. And the solution they came up with is way more creative than the existing laws around community land trust. So don't feel yourself limited to fit within some form that someone has already created. Each of these forms were created by people to meet some needs that they had. And so even if you don't have enabling legislation around community land trusts in particular, there are ways to set up collective entities that creatively figure out ways to share equity into the future and share it broadly in community that don't have to be rooted in formal structures for things that are called community land trusts. There are all kinds of trust laws and things and structures and contracts that can be created to carry out those ends.
I think North Carolina is a good example of a state where there's not a lot of legal forms and legislation that favor the kind of work that we do. And, you know, the General Assembly tends to be very tricky in terms of even just cities or counties coming up with creative ways to do things. It's a very challenging state politically. And so my best advice would be to find creative legal counsel, an attorney who won't tell you what to do, but who will listen to what community wants to achieve and then find a way to engineer structures and processes that make that possible. I always think, don't start with the answer, start with what you're trying to create and then find the answer that best meets that vision.
Yeah, the other thing I want to add too is that, like, let's be clear, community land trusts in and of themselves are not like the solution. There are a lot of community land trusts that I would say are like maybe in structure what we would want, but like in actual practice, like without the culture and like the intentional thought of building it to be like collectively governed and like really rooted in just values and principles, like they're ultimately, at least in my mind, no different than like condominiums, you know? So it's like, in addition to like, I really appreciate, Andrea, what you were saying there. In addition to that, it's like getting creative. It's also in places where they do have them. That is not like the solution in and of itself. Like you still have to do the deep organizing.
Awesome, thanks y'all. I saw one question in the chat that I know was answered a little bit in there, but somebody was asking about skills, like somebody was talking about skilling up so they could kind of participate in this work. So I'm curious from your vantage points if there are skill sets that are really needed to support this work.
I think the legal structuring is something I still grapple with, right? Whether it's going to be a charitable loan fund, is it housing the nonprofit? Are we building out a for-profit? What is this, a CDFI? Like that's a definite like thing that we would need just to kind of like roadmap that out and really think about what it means to us as far as what we need to skill up and build, and is it in alignment with our future vision? So yeah, definitely.
Awesome. All right, thanks y'all. I think we've covered most of the questions in the Q&A. So again, I'll say a huge thank you to our panelists. That was awesome. And yeah, you've been getting a lot of love in the chat. I think you should expect people in this who've been watching this to hit y'all up about some specifics. But yeah, thank you so much for that. And I'll pass it to you, Mika, to close us out.
Thank you. Let me get my final slides up here. Yeah, wow, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much to Anand, Ed, Jamie, Andrea, and Chris for being here with us today, for sharing with us. Thank you again to our co-sponsors for helping to make this event such a success. It was great to see so many people on and engaging in the chat. We love that. As a reminder, we'll be hosting the final session in this series on June 22nd. So please make sure that you register for that. And I know there were some questions even here today about how all this ties into retirement options, account types, that sort of thing. And we will be doing a deep dive into that on the 22nd. I will be sending a follow-up email to everyone here and who's registered with the registration link for that final webinar, a recording of today's conversation, our contact information, all of the amazing resources that were shared in the chat, as well as a copy of the slides. So you can look forward to that. Des is sharing a link right now to a very brief session evaluation in the chat. We want to, improve these webinars and make sure that they are relevant, helpful, inspiring to you. So please do share any feedback that you have with us using that evaluation link. As a final reminder, I mentioned this earlier, but if you're interested in a deeper analysis and discussion of retirement benefits across the board, not just focusing on investments, please join us on June 9th. It's sure to be a fantastic and very rich conversation. And finally, if you have questions for our team at Just Futures, feel free to reach out directly. And to learn more about our program, you can also visit our website, justfutures.co. Thank you so much, everyone. We look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and bye.
Thanks, Ed.